thank you to Mettowee Mint for having me here tonight. I appreciate it. I'm excited to share some interesting plants that hopefully some of you have never heard of before, never seen. And so because I had sort of it can be a mixed group of people with what they're familiar with, what certain plants they know. I'm sort of trying to hit like a bunch of different things. So maybe you've seen them before, but hopefully I'm gonna share with you some plants that you have never seen before. So my background is, for the past 2 years, I've been working as a rare plant botanist for an environmental consulting firm out of New England. We have 5 offices across New England. Prior to that, I worked for a forestry company in Vermont for 10 years, working as an invasive plant manager. So I spent a lot of time, some of that time in this area, killing invasive plants, telling landowners how to restore their habitats to something more native. And I started, I only really got into plants when I was in my late 20s. Went to school originally, took a class, plant taxonomy class, and I got a D in it when I was like 19. I went to UMass Amherst, partied too much. And so I totally thought that wasn't what I wanted to do. Switched to an English degree in writing, got an English degree in writing, moved down to North Carolina, got a bunch of different jobs. And then housing market crash, decided that I didn't want to do that type of work anymore. So I went back to school when I was 28 at Framingham State, got a wildlife biology degree, and then started volunteering at Native Plant Trust or New England Wildflower Society in the Rare Plant Conservation Division. So that's where I began cutting my teeth on rare plants, but then made another transition into sort of invasive plant management. But today, what I'm going to share with you is that some of the plants that I put on here are invasive, but the way that you get good at identifying plants is immersing yourself in it. So when you start seeing something that's all the same, and you can identify that plant, you start seeing the other things that are sort of between those plants. And that's when things start getting interesting, because you can sort of delete all of that stuff from your vision, and then you start seeing the rare things that pop up. And so that's how I was working as an invasive plant manager, but I was bored with looking at invasive plants, so started paying attention to everything else that was around, and then started writing reports for the state, like, oh, I found this rare plant, and that's how I got my name out there, and they started recognizing me for that, and that's how I got the job I have now. So I don't have a degree in botany, although I sort of like manufactured my way into this situation because it's something I love to do. And so it's not really work for me to go out in the woods and survey for something, because I love to do it, and that's what I want to be doing every day. So we're going to be doing, I call this Flora on the Fringe, a journey through New England's flora. It's really a journey through Vermont's flora. I kind of assumed that a lot of you would be local to this area, so I wanted to include a lot of plants that you might potentially see out on your landscape or in your woods or in your hiking trail. So one thing that we're going to have to, I refer to a lot throughout this presentation, is state ranks. Now, the way that states rank certain plant species is based on their occurrence numbers. So an S1 rank is going to be less than 5 known populations of that species. S2 is 20 or fewer. S3 is like less than 80 or fewer, or 80 or more. So you have all of these S ranks that have been determined based on historical herbarium records. So since colonists came here and started collecting plants and making an herbarium record for them, that's what all of these range maps that I'm going to show you is based on. So as somebody who's been doing this work for a long time, range maps are subject to change. Plants don't understand borders. There is no way that 100 or 150 years ago, botanists who were out there doing it for fun, combed every location in New England and knew exactly where all these rare plants were. And it's proven by people finding rare plants all the time that are new county records or have never been seen in that location before. They're new populations. So I'm here to tell you that all of you could be rare plant finders if you just pay attention out in the woods. A lot of the rare plants I find throughout my travels or like my work are oftentimes roadside or trailside, and like hundreds or thousands of people go by those plants on a daily basis, and nobody's ever stopped to just be like, oh, what are you? And then it's like, oh, this plant hasn't been seen here in 100 years. So it's about paying attention, but it's really based on knowing, start small with a certain group of plants, learn those, even around your house. You go out there, you see buckthorn or some kind of cinquefoil, learn those ones, and then when you go out into the woods, you start comparing those. And you're like, oh, this is a different one. Let's ID this plant here. And as a note on identifying plants, there are books, manuals out there for New England for you to go out. It's basically a dictionary for the woods. You have to understand a lot of terminology. There's an app or a website called Go Botany I use a lot. It has hot links for all of those terms. So while you're in the woods trying to key something out, you can click on those hot links and understand what the certain terminology is for all of this stuff. iNaturalist, if you guys don't use iNaturalist, this is the plug for it. iNaturalist is a really cool app. It's free. It's a community-based app. So when you go out into the woods, you take a photo, and you have to take good photos, and I recommend 4 of them. So there would be a picture of the flower, a picture of the leaf, a picture of the stem, and then a picture of the plant in habitat. You upload those with ideally a picture with a flower and a leaf in it. The app takes into account your location, the plant species that have been seen in that area before, and then it gives you recommendations on what it thinks this plant is, this species is. And so it doesn't stop there, though. You submit it, and then there's going to be someone like me or someone else come in there and look at that observation and say, yes, I agree with Matt that this is this species. And then it gets a research grade designation. And that means that other people are going to use that for scientific purposes, and I use it all the time. This is a picture of my actual online, there's a desktop version. So you can see all of my observations that I've had over the course of my use of this app. There's almost 5,000 observations, and I've seen almost 1,700 species. So with this, now I can go back in time. It's like having a book where you used to keep a list of every species you've ever seen. Now I have it all online, and I can go back and say, in 2018, I saw this plant at this location. What else was there? And then I can see what else I saw there. Or I look at flowering times, because it's required for me to go out at particular times to see flowers for the proper identification. I can look on this and see all of the observations across the world of that plant, what time it's flowering, and the phenology of it, so I know that I'm going to target that specific window to see that plant. I also use it to find new populations of rare plants, like this one here. So this is Collinsonia canadensis, Canada horsebalm, also called citronella horsebalm. It's got a square stem. The leaves smell very much like a citronella candle. This is a plant that up until, I maybe saw this for the first time 2015, and it was big. It has really beautiful flowers. So these can be completely yellow sometimes. Sometimes this little fringed lip is like a maroon color. And because I had never seen it before, I was like, oh, I want to know if this is in Vermont, because that's where I was living. It was listed as an S2 in Vermont, which means 20 or fewer populations. It's not listed at all in Massachusetts, and I was upset by that. I was like, how can that be? So the New England Botanical Society funded a little project that I thought up of trying to find new populations of this plant in Vermont. I used all the historical records to go back to those properties and then branch out into neighboring properties, so I had to get permission to go survey these areas. Ended up finding a bunch of new populations. And then recently I used iNaturalist because it wasn't seen in Windham County, I went into iNaturalist and I wanted to see where they found the closest one in Massachusetts, which was down in Greenfield. And they're all connected by water. The seeds spread by water. So I was like, I'm just going to follow this river up to the state line, which is Halifax. Went down to the state line in Halifax, started walking backwards along the Green River into Vermont. Oh, and what do you know? It's right there. It's on the side of the river. So I knew that those seeds had to be coming from upstream, getting deposited. That population has to be further up that stream in Vermont. So a new population. My goal is to make this not an S2 in the state, to find enough populations to rank this up to S3 to make the state do that. So the first thing we're going to dig into is the loosestrife family. First one on the screen there on the left-hand side is purple loosestrife. So it's an invasive. They have recently, released some beetles to deal with this invasive species. So we're seeing like a little bit less and less of it. But as you can see from the Go Botany website, they're always listed in purple if they're non-native or invasive. So these range maps are just swiped from the New England Botanical, or the Native Plant Trust Go Botany website. This next one is one that some of you might be familiar with. It's called swamp loosestrife, Dicoton verticillatus, which is a swampy plant. You'll find it in wetlands a lot. It often grows like, prostrate on the ground. It'll start climbing up some shrubs in there. But it's a great pollinator plant, maybe one that some of you are not familiar with. That's the range of it there. So you see it just on the western side of the state in Vermont. This next one is an S1, which means, again, 5 or fewer populations. This was a new population that was found a couple years ago. This is the winged loosestrife. So in contrast to the purple loosestrife, the invasive one, which grows, like big wands out in wetlands, this one grows along the ground, almost like, it won't get any higher than this. And it grows all along the ground. And I was lucky enough to find the last flower in bloom on that species. And it does have like a patchy distribution across New England. But again, one that I wouldn't expect to see, it kind of bothers me that Windham County, down in the southeastern part of the state, is blank there. So these green markings are showing you that this is where it's known to occur based on herbarium records. There's a gap here, and that bothers me because I don't believe that, it doesn't exist here, even though it is an S1 in the state. I feel like someone's going to find it in Windham County at some point, just based on the distribution of the other counties that it's in. This next group, we commonly call these the loosestrifes, or yellow loosestrifes. They are not loosestrifes, though. They are in the primrose family. And so this first one is a very common species, so it's an S5. It occurs everywhere. It's a gorgeous, it usually lives on the edge of a wetland in the upland, so you won't see it directly in the wetlands, but if your soil's a little wetter, this plant will show up. And these can be identified out of flower. So what happens is the two opposite leaves come down and touch the stem, and there's little ciliate hairs, which refers to ciliata, which is the specific epithet for that species. But you'll notice these little clear, almost white appendages sticking out of where the leaves intersect the stem on that plant. And the range on that, almost everywhere, except for that one county in New Hampshire, which is also interesting, in another county in Massachusetts, maybe. This next one is Lysimachia thyriciflora, which I have only seen out of flower, which is upsetting to me. But look at the flower structure on these. It's almost like a mimosa tree, with all those really interesting structures to it. And so this one is normally found in wetter areas in richer soils. So the western part of Vermont is very different than the eastern part of Vermont. And you can tell that a lot of times by the plant species that are found there. So this one would be in like a calcareous fen type situation, along with poison sumac and other rich species. The next one, which I have never seen, this Lysimachia hybrida, it's called lowland yellow loosestrife, an S1 in the state. Now this one only occurs in the topmost part of Vermont. And so the rarity on some of these plants, sometimes you're dealing with plants that are reaching their southern range, so they're normally a Canadian boreal species that's sort of coming down into Massachusetts and then petering out. The other alternate version of that is it's at its northern range, so more southern species reaching its maximum up here in Massachusetts, sometimes southern Vermont. The Boraginaceae family, the borage family, Hydrophyllum, we have 2 species here in New England. The first one, Virginianum, is such an awesome plant. I'm surprised it's not planted more for landscape situations. It grows like a ground cover. Pollinator benefits, it has a bunch of flowers on it. They're really easy to transplant. They're really easy to grow. They have beautiful foliage. They're called water leaf. So when you look at the leaf in certain situations in the woods, it has mottling on it. And so we have a lot of plants in New England that either overwinter or they're early to come out of the ground. And they have this dappled mottling on them. Think of a trout lily. The leaves on those, when you see them, they're sort of green and maroon, and they're splotchy. So something like that is an evolutionary adaptation to deer browse, because if those plants are going to overwinter or come up early, they're trying to mimic dappled sunlight coming through sort of like a open canopy and try to avoid getting browse. And that's really the only way they can do that, is to have that dappling on their leaves and avoid getting eaten so that they can reproduce. So this Virginia waterleaf is super common. The other one here, it's called Hydrophyllum canadense. That one has leaves that very much look like maple leaves. Now you could mistakenly think that this was a maple sapling, although you have, if you look at the photo, you have multiple stems coming out of the ground here. So, a sapling is going to have a single stem. This, where it's all coming off of the sort of like rhizome of the plant, you have multiple stems with one leaf on it. Also very similar flower structure on these, but the leaves are drastically different. You can see the leaves in the water leaf, the Virginia water leaf, are sort of longer, and they're a little bit more divided than these leaves here that sort of have that maple leaf shape to them. This plant down in something like North Carolina is super common. You see them growing next to each other, although in Vermont, this one is only occurring in Bennington County, so the furthest southwestern county in Vermont. Again, this is one that's reaching its northern range here, so a lot more common down south, meeting its maximum up here in Vermont. This colt's foot, I'm sure all of you have familiar with colt's foot. It's kind of become like the first flower for us in Vermont to come out. You see it on the roadsides. It is an invasive. It came here late 1700s or 1800s for medicinal purposes. They have since escaped. You'll notice here that there's a sort of time difference between the flowering time and then when it leaves out. So there's two life stages. This is the picture you're seeing here with the yellow flowers is early spring. As those flowers mature into seeds, you're eventually going to have the leaves come up out of the ground. Sometimes this is called butterbur, and they have quite big leaves that are sort of shaped like a spade. The native, sister to this plant is Petasites frigidus. This is one of those plants that has a distribution that is normally up in Canada and the western part of the United States. So this plant happens to be rare here, so it's an S2. It only occurs in like 5 or 6 counties here, but they're very small populations and they're out in swamps. Now, if you go out to the west coast, this plant acts similar to colt's foot here. So it grows in ditches, roadsides, people see it everywhere, and it's like it's a weed. And you can tell, this is a map from iNaturalist. You can see the density, how much more red it gets here. So this is like an area where there's a lot of these plants. And then sort of as you come down in here, this is New England. There's probably been like 5 or 6 observations of this plant ever here. I have yet to find this plant out in the woods anywhere, although I have been looking very hard around Stratton. They don't flower very often here. That's my understanding anyway. Out on the West Coast, you see flowers all the time. But here, they tend to be like in shadier conditions, and I have never seen this plant, but from the pictures I've seen, they're usually only in vegetative form. So I'm not sure what that is about, but it's something to, think about. But that leaf shape is what I'm usually looking for out in the woods, because that's, it's almost like a world palmate, mixed leaf. That's pretty distinctive. So the blueberry family, the Ericaceae, we have a number, this family is so big, and it's pretty cool because they can live in very low nutrient conditions. And some of them are what's called saprophytic, which means that they don't produce their own chlorophyll. So ghost pipe is the first one there on the left. Ghost pipe is normally white, but sometimes the ghost pipe is this pinkish color. And At first, I thought that maybe it had something to do with what it was parasitizing. So it parasitizes fungi, mostly Rossella species mushrooms. And Rossella, if you guys are familiar, they're like a reddish color. I had somebody who was doing research on these reach out to me and say they were looking into that, and it wasn't actually because of the species of mushroom that they were parasitizing that was causing this color variation. And so I'm not sure why they're pink, but I'm always excited when I see a pink one in the forest. Now this name, Monotropa uniflora means one flower. So what you have here on that ghost pipe is you have one flower. Another related species, they actually used to be in the same genus, is this other one, Hypopodes, which you see in the middle. That's yellow pine sap. Now if you look at that, you can see multiple flowers on the head. So a way to identify these, if you're ever curious, you're like, oh, that looks like ghost pipe, but it's different. Notice how many flowers are on each inflorescence, and you'll see multiple flowers there. And they're normally like a yellow, brownish color. I've never seen one be stark white like that, like the ghost pipe would be. And there's another version of this, which has been since moved into another specific species. They used to be like varieties of each other. This is called hairy pine sap. This one is almost always this like vibrant magenta red color. Now these are super common down in like Connecticut, southern Massachusetts, but as you get further up here, they get more and more rare. So ghost pipe is not rare here, but these, especially this hairy pine sap, the red one, is an S1 in this state. Now, so here's your distribution for that hairy pine sap. You can see it only occurs in one county, but in Massachusetts and Connecticut, it's sort of like throughout. This other one, I told you before about plants not understanding boundaries, range maps. They don't care about that. This plant here, this is called pine drops, Pterospora andromeda, or Pterospora andromeda. Not really known from Massachusetts. 2 years ago, it was discovered as a new population. They had never known it to be from the state, so there were no herbarium records for this. Nobody had ever seen it before. Some random person was out in the woods hiking, took a picture of it, put it on iNaturalist. The state saw it and was like, oh, let's go check that out. And so they found a whole new population of this plant, and it got marked up to an S1. Now the other, similar to that Petasites that I showed you where it's super common out west, this plant, which I have never seen in the woods before because it's so rare here, super common out on the West Coast. If you follow people on Instagram on the West Coast, you see them posting pictures of this all the time. And then as soon as you get up into like Quebec, it starts showing up everywhere, and there's tons of observations for it. But you can see here, it's spotty in Vermont and then up in the White Mountains. And then it was blank from Massachusetts and Connecticut. And these range maps are based, these were created in 2014, so they're 10 years, a little bit out of date. And so that's why it's a good depiction, though, of showing that it was never here before, and now all of a sudden it popped up. The Orobanchiae family, unfortunate common name. It has something to do with, this family has what's called hostoria, which are little connections on their roots. They connect to other plants' roots, and they rob from it. And so broom is a reference to some other, it probably used to be like brome, which is another species of plant. And the rape is just stealing nutrients from other plants. So this whole family, there's a number of different genera in this family. Some of them are photosynthetic, some of them aren't. So some of them are completely relying on those connections through their roots to steal nutrients and survive. This first plant, Pedicularis canadensis, you can find pretty much everywhere, especially in Massachusetts. In Vermont, if you wanted tips to go see this, and you guys live around here, there's a quarry up the road off North Road. Go up there into that, there's a main trail there, it's owned by the Nature Conservancy. Hike up that main trail all the way up to the top, and there's a whole big patch of it right on the right-hand side. I just recently found out, today while I was looking at things, I found a patch of this yesterday or the day before. The color variation on the flower. So you'll notice that this flower has sort of a maroon top part of its flower, and then it has this golden colored lip. There's actually 3 forms that show up, and I saw them all growing in the same area, which was kind of mind-blowing. There's another form that has sort of like caramel colored, both top and bottom parts of the flower. And then there's another one that has a maroon and a white part of the flower. And so when I saw these, it was in the biggest population I've ever seen, and they were everywhere. And I was like, why? I was going to ask the question, why is that? But then I just Googled it, and it told me that there's 3 different forms out there. So now I know. It's interesting to see them all growing together, though, because normally I would think that, they wouldn't, maybe the genetics are mixing in a certain way, but you'll find out that if you get into botany, you ask more and more questions every day, and you start finding out more and more cool things about different plants you never knew before. So this is a photosynthetic one. This one is making its own food as well as parasitizing usually goldenrods, although sometimes it parasitizes grasses and sedges. This next one is one of my favorite plants ever, called a Phylon uniflorum. So again, one flower. This is also called one-flowered cancer root. Again, a reference to like cancer stealing nutrients from another plant. These can sometimes be white. I got lucky and found one that was sort of had this purple coloration to it, which was really beautiful. These are annuals. So they're an annual that attaches to root systems of perennials to steal nutrients, does not photosynthesize, so it's not making any of its own food. And then it's going to complete its life cycle and then put out more seed. And then it kind of blows my mind that an annual can do that, because it just seems like a lot of time and risk to put into your progeny that you're going to say, I'm an annual, go out there and find, you have one chance to go find a host to help you survive. But it could be, I don't know how long these seeds last in the seed bank. Sometimes native plant seeds can last in the seed bank for 100 years. So maybe those seeds are going to wait for that right opportunity when a goldenrod comes in or some other host plant comes in that it can attach to. But then again, how would it know that? This next one is sometimes called oak leech. Again, a reference to taking nutrients, right? Oriolaria pedicularia. That pedicularia is a reference to pedicularis. So this Oriolaria plant has fern-like leaves, similar to the Pedicularis canadensis plant. And this one is commonly called, other than oak leech, fern-leafed false foxglove. So there's a number of different species in New England, and these are particularly adapted to leach off the roots of oak trees. So usually find them along rights of way, edges where oak trees are growing. You'll find these plants sort of like propped up in between where there's enough sunlight and enough shade for them to latch onto those root systems. And this one happens to be pretty rare in Vermont, only occurring in 2 counties there. But once you get down into Massachusetts and Connecticut, pretty frequently shows up if the conditions are right. The Rhamnaceae family, or the buckthorn family, we've got 2 invasive species here in New England, glossy false buckthorn and common buckthorn or European buckthorn. So your glossy buckthorn is on the left-hand side there. Those leaves, if you notice, they're pretty shiny. If you flip the leaf over, it's got what I call fishbone venation. And so if you've ever filleted a fish, you notice that you can see those small, tiny bones sort of like sticking through the flesh. If you flip these leaves over, you can actually see it in the photo. On the back side, they're so raised that if you run your finger across it, you'll feel the ridges on the veins there. They could be confused with something like a cherry, but cherries have serrate edges, so it'll be like a little fine-toothed edge on the edge of the leaf. These ones have an entire edge, which just means it's very smooth around the edge. Common buckthorn is a true buckthorn, and the reason why they call it buckthorn is that in the axis of the stem on the branch, there's a thorn here. So if you ever, next time you go out and see common buckthorn, just pull down a branch and just touch the inside of one of the axes, and you'll feel a pretty sharp thorn there. The glossy buckthorn does not have these thorns. So these are both invasive plants. Glossy buckthorn, a little bit more common around where I live in southern Vermont. The common buckthorn is more common in sort of like the Rutland area north. And these were provided to us by our government, in the 30s and 40s for wildlife habitat improvements. So NRCS, I love NRCS now, but didn't like them in the 40s. They gave us like autumn olive, multiflora rose, the buckthorns, and they said here, because everything was ag land, they wanted to restore the ag land for wildlife. So here's a bunch of things that grow really well, and they're gonna have fruit and all this stuff, right? So that blew up in our face. And so now they're out of control and everywhere. And the seeds, the fruits don't really provide any nutrients for our wildlife because they haven't evolved with it. So the fruits actually act like a diuretic. When they eat those, when birds eat those berries, they go and sit on your edge line or your fence posts and they poop them out, and then that's where new plants grow. So we didn't really think about that in the 40s. Invasive plants really wasn't a thing. And this is a variegated one, which is interesting to me that I found one time. I've never seen a variegated glossy buckthorn except on that day. And if it hadn't been invasive, I probably would have tried to propagate it because it looks so cool. It was like crystal white and sort of like that splotchy tie-dye leaf just looked really awesome. But they also, just so you all are aware, there's now this new cultivar out for glossy buckthorn that sort of has really thin leaves. And it doesn't look like the glossy buckthorn will have leaves like that. This now has leaves that are like, super thin and they're long. And they're getting sold at garden centers and stuff like that. And people aren't realizing that it's still the invasive and they are escaping. And so this trait that they have may just revert back to a regular leaf later. So just be aware of when you buy things, it could be a problem. The last one here on the right-hand side of the screen is our native buckthorn. So hardly anyone ever realizes that we have all of these invasive plants that we talk about. We usually have a native counterpart. And if you think about why we have a native counterpart, those two continents, Asia, Europe, and North America, were together at one time. So they all shared a common ancestor, but they divided, species differentiated. And so now we have like glossy buckthorn and common buckthorn that are from Europe and Asia versus our native species that diverged from that. And so this is not a tree or a shrub, really. It grows like ground cover. And you usually find it in wetlands, really rich wetlands, so calcareous soils. I hardly ever see fruit or flowers on it. I bet it gets browsed by deer very heavily. But I've never been able to collect seed or try to grow it because I see it so infrequently, even though it's an S5 here, but the habitat that it occurs in is usually hard to get to, and it's, nobody goes out there to really see them. So that's a cool little connection to make between our invasive plants and our native plants and why we have these things here and why they're invasive, right? Because after that division happened and those species differentiated, insects, animals, birds, all of those things started evolving with those species. And so now when you take that plant from Asia and put it back into an ecosystem where nothing's evolved with it, it can just go out of control and just take over. Because nothing's eating it, nothing's using it. There's nothing really stopping it from being out of control. All right, the rose family. Interesting thing about the rose family and this is just a small sidebar. Roses, the Rosaceae is the family, but then there's the Rosa genus within that family. I have talked to some people about this genus, and they said that a lot of our species that fall into that genus right now, we're basically watching evolution happen before our very eyes. Because that genus is evolving in real time, it hasn't really decided what species it wants to be yet. And so sometimes we don't key out. Botanists take certain genera and say, they're too complicated or they hybridize. So I'm just gonna give it a genus level name and say this is a complex. So the Rosa genus in particular, like where multiflora rose and Carolina rose, Virginia rose, swamp rose, all of those things, they may actually be the same species, just showing different phenotypical differences based on the environment that they're in. So if they grow in a dry habitat, they show up looking like a Carolina rose or a Virginia rose, and if they show up in a swamp, they end up showing up like palustris, the swamp rose. So that's a little sidebar on that, and Amelanchier, the last one that I'm going to talk about, is similar to that. But first, this plant, which I only found a couple years ago. Somebody posted it online, and I was like, what? You know, I had never seen it before. And so I found a place where I could go find it. But this is called Comarum palustra, which palustra means like of the swamp. So these are, they look very similar to a cinquefoil leaf. So if you ever, cinquefoil kind of looks like a palm-shaped leaf with rounded leaves on it. And you probably see them in your yard. They have yellow flowers on them. And then it's got pretty, like, it's pretty heavily toothed along the edge of the leaf. But it looks like a little hand. Sometimes they grow like vines. This leaf on this looks just like that, except this thing has maroon red, beautiful flowers, and it grows in a wetland all the time. So the distribution on that is all over Vermont. And so I lived here for 8 years before I actually saw one. I had to go hunting for it and go out into like the wettest place possible, but I found it. This next one is called, it's called Geum or Geum, or it used to be called Geum or Geum. It's now called Waldsteinia. And so luckily we live in an age today where a lot of DNA work has been done. Botanists have always been plagued by changes in names, moving one plant to a different family or a different genus based on what it looks like. But now that we have DNA information, we can just test those and then see how these plants are actually related. And so that's why over the past 10 years, we've sort of had this like change in a lot of names. And you've seen like Cornus, which is the dogwood group, get broken out into 4 different genera. Some people are resistant to that. They're called lumpers, and they're splitters. I'm a splitter. So, you know, some people are just like super comfortable in their everything's a Cornus delusion. And then there's this other group that want to split everything out, because that's how you really start caring for native plants, is like, is this plant really rare? It should be different than this other one because of this situation. And there's a whole process for that. But this plant you can find, you know, it's usually in a more boreal situation. If you went up to the Stratton trailhead and walked out towards the Somerset Reservoir, this is growing alongside the trail there. And it's probably in flower right now. But you notice the leaves there. If you guys are familiar with gold thread, coptis, it's a similar looking leaf. And coptis is super common in the boreal areas. It'll be all over the ground as a ground cover. These leaves are slightly bigger. They're a little more papery, and they're going to have the yellow flowers on them versus gold thread, which will have a white flower. But again, this plant, I've seen it down in Guilford. I've only seen it, you know, 4, 5, 6, 7 times, and it's not everywhere, even though it's listed as it's an S5 in Vermont. So that means it's super common. They're usually patchy distributions of them. So I'll find a patch, and then I won't see it for the rest of the day. And then, you know, 8 months later, I'll find another patch somewhere. But it's not everywhere. But I have transplanted some of these. They do grow pretty well, and they have a little, you know, red fruit at the end of the season that is, I think they're inedible. Or maybe they're not inedible, but they don't taste good, but wildlife will eat them. This next one, Amelanchier, is one of the genera in the rose family that a lot of botanists sort of don't key out because it's pretty frustrating. They hybridize a lot. So you'll get a particular plant that looks like one species, but then it has characteristics on the flower of another species. And so that's when we say, like, this is like the Amelanchier complex, and we just throw it all into one big group. But this one, you don't need to do that with, because it is so identifiable that anyone can do it. And if you look at the plant, the flowers on there are always going to occur in a group of 2 or 3. So they're pretty small, you know, maybe they get up to chest high. So normally this is also called shadbush or serviceberry. They grow pretty tall. They're more like a tree than a shrub. These ones are truly like shrubby. and they'll grow in the understory or along trails, and they'll just be about this high. But you can also ID these in fruit after they're out of flower because you can count how many fruits are on each inflorescence. The other native species that you're going to see, and shadbush season is it's probably just over now. When you drive along the highways, though, you can see all those white blooming flowers, right? Those have inflorescences with like 5, 6 to 10 flowers on them, and they're very big. They're much bigger. So that's a great one. That one's also out at Stratton. And this one in particular happens to be one that's reaching its southern range in Massachusetts. So in Massachusetts, this is listed as like a special concern plant, which is, they think it's rare. I don't see it very often down in Massachusetts, but in Vermont, you have it in Windham and Bennington and Rutland counties. But again, something I don't see, every day. The lopseed family, this one has this yellow flowered plant here. This used to be in Mimulus. Mimulus is the Allegheny monkey flower genus, which if you've ever walked by a wetland or something in June, July, August, you see little blue flowers with a yellow lip on them, and they sort of resemble a monkey face. So they call those the Allegheny monkey flower. And this one used to be in that genus, although they moved it to a new genus called Erythrane. And it's called the musk monkey flower. This grows as a ground cover kind of in wetlands, always in seeps, drainage ditches, stuff like that. The interesting thing about this plant is that when you go back into the herbarium record, this plant's listed as an S3 here, so there's 80 or fewer populations. In Massachusetts, it's an S2, which means that it's rare, and they spend money to protect it. Now, if you go back and look at the herbarium record, the very first herbarium record for this plant says on the voucher, it's from the late 1700s, early 1800s, says on the voucher that this was an escapee from a pot. Now, the distribution on this plant is split. So you have population showing up on the eastern seaboard, and then you have lots of population showing up on the western seaboard. They think that it's what's called a disjunct population. So they can't determine how that plant got from the west coast to the east coast. It kind of attaches up through Canada. So they spend a lot of money on it, but there's an herbarium record that says that it was introduced. So somebody needs to do DNA testing on this population versus the western populations to determine if the state should actually be spending money to protect these things, or if they might be introduced non-native species. Now, when I see this plant in the woods, it doesn't appear to be a non-native invasive species. It doesn't seem to be taking over areas, outcompeting other plants. It seems very much to be restricted to habitats that are seepy or wetlands, and it's not really escaping into the other areas. So I am hopefully doing some research for a client, if they're going to pay for it, to do the DNA testing on this at some point and make that determination, which I think would be really fun. But you can see even on GoBotany, it listed as an introduced species in Maine, Eastern Mass, and Connecticut, and then marks it as a native species in Franklin County, Mass, up through Vermont. So again, something that catches my eye and says, why is this like this? Similar to that Allegheny monkey flower that I described to you earlier, this is another Mimulus species that probably no one has ever heard of. It's called winged monkey flower. Has some winged appendages on the flower parts there. But if you notice, if you're familiar with what Allegheny monkey flower looks like in that blue color, this one is like a soft pink color. And so when I was in Connecticut doing some invasive work, this was actually growing in a sea of Japanese stiltgrass, which was horrible. This plant stuck out because it had that soft pink color to the flower, and I was like, that's something I've never seen before. So I started keying it out, and then it ended up being this other species, which I had never seen before. But it is uncommon, or an S3 in Connecticut, so there's no state obligation to protect it, which is sad because there were only a handful of plants there, and I'm sure that prior to stiltgrass taking over, it was a pretty dense population, I would imagine. But if you look at the distribution on this, just through the center Connecticut River Valley through Massachusetts and then down into Connecticut and along the coast. This next one is a common species, American lopseed. So the reason why I put this one in there is because it's probably overlooked by a lot of us all the time. Very pretty flowers, that soft pink, white lip. They're rather long and they're rather tiny. So they're usually like, think the size, a little bit bigger than an eraser head on a pencil. These grow in the shade of like, northern hardwood forests, along trail sides, along roadsides. You can probably see this everywhere. It's a S5 in the state, so pretty much anywhere you go, you're going to be able to see this plant out there in the woods. I'm going to tell you some plants that are you've probably never heard of, but they're super easy to grow. This is one of my favorite plants of all time, Trichostoma dicotomum, or the forked blue curls. This is in the mint family. Now these plants are, maybe they'll get this big. They like sandy, dry habitats. So you can see that, in Massachusetts and Connecticut and Rhode Island, they're pretty much ubiquitous everywhere. If you walked onto any power line in those states, you're probably going to see it. But it goes so, unnoticed by the general population that nobody's really growing it or, providing it. And the smell on this, we all know that mint family plants usually smell really good. This one has like a musky, minty smell to it. And I can smell it before I see it when I walk onto a power line. Once you know what it smells like, it's like, I don't even know how to describe it. You should go out there and try to find it though sometime. But look at the little spotting on the lower lip there. And then those, stamens and that pistil that come over the top there and kind of hook back. It's just a gorgeous little plant to have as a native species, and especially one that's everywhere in New England. But, growing this from seeds, super easy. Generally, seeds require a stratification period. Our native seeds do. So if you think about what nature does, plants are going to grow up, they reproduce, grow seed, and then they just drop it or distribute it through animals, birds, whatever. But most of the time, those seeds sit out for an entire winter, out on top of the soil, and then they germinate in the spring. So whenever you're trying to grow native seeds, you have to do that same process. Put them in a tray, and then put them out and let them stratify for up to 90 days, and then they'll germinate in the spring. And that's how you get native plants to sort of, you can grow them on your own. You don't have to buy them from anywhere because our native seeds are particularly hard to get. Although if you all follow me on Instagram at some point, I sell native seeds every fall from wild populations. This one, Elymus hystrix, a really interesting grass that grows in floodplains, wetlands. It'll get this tall, and the inflorescence on it can be like this. It looks similar to what you'd clean, that's why they call it bottle brush grass. But these awns, if you see these long pieces here are called awns. They can be that long, and these again are super easy to grow. These are the seeds here. As they mature, you can just take those. I usually just, as I'm walking by, I'll just stick my thumb down and just strip the seed head off it. And then you lay it in a community pot with soil. They'll germinate in the spring. I have a bunch going at the house right now. And so that is a great plant to have. It has, I don't know why it's not used more as a landscape plant because it's so interesting looking, and they're always talking about like, winter interest or, what does the foliage look like? These plants, as long as you don't get a lot of snow, which we do here, but they'll last until the fall. They'll stay standing, and they have that sort of like winter interest that all the landscapers like. Sorghastrum nutans, which is the Indian grass. Again, you can just tell from these photos, this is another native grass species that we have here in Vermont and New England. The coloration, especially with the sun coming through those inflorescences, this has like, blue, yellow, red, orange, purple, brown. It's like, and if these are grown in a dense cluster, the, landscaping use for this is underused a lot, I think. I think we need to be having a little bit more of these native grasses on our landscape, especially because of the habitat benefits and wildlife benefits for them. And so you can see here, super common in southern New England, and then sort of reaches up into the middle part of Vermont there. But again, another sandy, loves sandy, dry habitats. Fireweed, this one covers the entire New England region for nativity. These actually grow on the side of 30 down by where it intersects, or where 11 intersects 30 going back towards like Jamaica. You can see them on the roadside. In the fall, these have what's called a follicle. So similar to what milkweed seeds look like. You guys are all familiar with those fruits. Inside, all of those seeds wrapped around, that's called a follicle. And so these have the same type of structure, although they'll be thinner. But you'll see them start dispersing seed on the side of the road. Oddly enough, when I've grown these don't require any sort of stratification period. I've put them right in under a grow light, grown them in the winter in my house, and had ones that I've stratified also grow. Now they take a few years to flower. I think I got one flower a couple years ago. I'm hoping that this is the year that these actually take off and we get a bunch of flowers. Hedioma pugiloides, which is the American pennyroyal. Again, this one is tiny, small plant, but in the mint family, smells amazing. This one is like spearmint. I don't know why we ever started selling non-native mints, because this one it's an annual, super easy to grow. I grew it last year from seed, had it all go to flower, and when I went out there a couple days ago to check on my artificial sand plain habitat, there are seedlings of this everywhere. So it's reseeding itself in this little garden that I built, which I am excited about. But again, the amount of flowers that this will put out and the benefit of, you could make tea out of it, it has all the same benefits as our non-native mints. Why are we growing these non-native mints? We could be growing something that's native, supporting ecosystems, pollinators, habitat, etc. Aster family. So green-headed coneflower, that is one of my favorite Helianthus species, or Rudbeckia species. These are down in like Arlington, on a floodplain, usually in a little bit of a wetter situation. Super easy to grow, although it's hard to get enough seeds off a seed head. There's something going on with development, and at least in my experience from the seed heads that I tried to capture, I only got like 20 or 30 seeds out of them. They did not flower in their first year, and I think they're putting up flower stalks at my house right now. They'll flower sort of later in the summer into August. But gorgeous things. They'll get tall, big, showy sunflowers. This other one, Solidago macrophylla, this is our endemic Solidago species. So it's not rare. It's not listed anywhere. But it is only found in our region. And you can find it in the woods out in like Green Mountain National Forest along a trailside. So its macrophylla is like big flowered. So it actually has pretty decently sized, flowers for a goldenrod, maybe the size of a dime. But you can notice that, a lot of goldenrods have congested inflorescences. This one kind of spreads them out with singular flowers everywhere coming out of the axils of where the leaves are. So that's really exciting to have a species here in New England that nobody else gets to have. Cresia virginica, this is the dwarf dandelion. So, we have the non-native dandelion that you see everywhere on the roadsides in your lawn, all of that. This is our native version of that. These plants are tiny. They maybe get this big. They're flowering right now, so they're an early flowering plant. Again, another dry species, really easy to grow from seed. But the flower heads on them are probably, the size of an eraser head, so pretty tiny. But such a beautiful little flower for such a small plant. I like that one a lot. Okay, so pseudonaphthalum. This is the, you guys are probably familiar with like pearly everlasting. Pseudonaphthalum has 3 species here in New England. Obtusifolium, which is the one, or rabbit tobacco, the one that we see is pretty common everywhere. And we have another species which is pictured here. This is called McCown's everlasting. the difference here is that if you notice this leaf, so this leaf is it's called decurrent on the stem. So you can see that this leaf kind of goes down the stem there and along like tail. So it's actually like clasping the stem, but it's traveling down it. And the other obtusifolium is this one. So you can see on the stem here, there's not those decurrent little tails. So this, when I found it, caught my eye because I had never seen one do that. The flowers, look almost identical to the other species. So that's not an identifying characteristic for me. So I had to dig into that to figure out where it was actually, what species it actually was. And then when I did that, I found out that there was another species called Macrandianum, which is this guy here. Now, the interesting thing about this is an iNaturalist search function for that species. Has never been seen on iNaturalist. So, but it's in our herbarium record for showing up in places like, this is the range map for it. So it shows up in like eastern Maine or western Maine and then eastern New Hampshire. The internet has everything these days. I could not find a photo of a live specimen of this plant to know, because this makes me want to go find it. I want to go find out where this plant is, because it's listed as extirpated or historical from these locations or extinct. So I want to go find it in these locations. The only information I can find is an herbarium record from a long time ago. It's probably like over 100 years old. From Leamington, Maine, on Sand Pond. So it's probably from like the late 1800s, so it probably hasn't been seen in 100 years. But what bothered me was there were no photos of it online, so I don't know what it looks like. Nobody's really ever seemingly seen it. And this is its native range, listed in a lot of places, extirpated from this area and these states. I reached out to a guy from Wisconsin. There was one photo I could find, but it was like the worst photo from 10 feet away. And so I said, do you have any other photos of this that I can look at? He sent me one a little bit closer, but they never took diagnostic photos of anything about it. So I can't, I'm going to go out there and try to find it in August, but I'm going to have to like key out every pseudoanaphyllum that I come across until I find the one that matches with the key. But again, like super interesting that all of this information's out there and you sort of have to like piece it together. And if you guys are interested in, like I gave you, there's 2,500 native species in New England. I gave you like not even a scratching the surface version of all of that because I had like 45 minutes. But if you want to go in and explore that stuff, you go on to Go Botany, just type in Go Botany on Google. You can search through families, genera, species, and that will show you all of those species, native or not native, to our area. But then you can go down and see how many species actually occur around you and things to keep, things to look out for. And I learn, even though I've looked at that website a million times, I find new things. I'm like, oh, why didn't I know about that before? So I'm constantly in a process of learning, just like hopefully all of you are, about plants and their distributions and their habitats and what they look like and how to find them. If you have questions later and want to reach out, you can find me on Instagram or YouTube or whatever. I'm also happy to give out my email address if you guys have other questions about plants or invasive plants, either one. Thanks.